Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult, video number 262, Accepted versus Non-Accepted Superstition. The idea of the difference, or rather, lack thereof in some ways, between prayer, invocation, things that are within the accepted religious core of a society or religion, and outside of it. For instance, and I've covered this briefly before, but I don't think I ever made a full video on the topic. Prayer, like in the general Christian sense of today, what do you do when you're praying? You're asking God for intercession, your Christian God. The only real difference between that and the sort of invocations you'll find in most forms of witchcraft is that in witchcraft, in some cases, it's not a request, and it's not to what you would consider an all-encompassing deity a la the Christian or Islamic God or the Judeo-Christian God. It would be a request or even a command of other forces. Sometimes they come from within, sometimes they come from without. There's really no fundamental difference here. For instance, the idea of differentiating God as being all-powerful, omniscient, omnipresent, so forth, that's just one of a number of potential arrangements for a deity. You could conceive of a deity as being far more anthropic in nature, far more like a human with emotions, capable of being fallible, incapable of being perfect. The idea that it has to be a perfect being, in again, some subjective sense, that's an accepted belief within many religions. There are also religions that completely shun that notion. For instance, if you look at the Hindu pantheon, you technically have one all-encompassing the in-breathing and out-breathing of Brahma, sort of singular force, but you have many avatars, expressions, forces, lesser beings. These are not infallible. They have their own sort of goings-ons. It's almost like a cosmic soap opera at times. They would not believe in that same cosmo-conception. If you look at prayer, the Christian, the way that they pray, they would look at the way that I would conduct an invocation or prayer loosely termed or something, and they would not accept that. They would consider that odd. They'd consider it superstition. They'd say, well, that can't work. That's bullshit. But they're doing the same thing. The only difference is they're doing it in a proper place, asking for proper things from a proper deity according to that particular perspective. This gets a little bit into the realm of subjectivity, but when you're talking about any true, concrete, objective spiritual system, that's not the same as the very subjective, very human, opinionated description of it. Within religion, some people understand this. You have, for instance, people who shun organized religion in the Christian sense and call themselves Jesus worshippers. They grant that the God believed in is real. They grant that Jesus is the Son of God, or an expression or component of that God, a force of that spiritual nature. But they don't believe in all of the other things that are there. They shun that accepted sort of core of that religion because they've come to a different understanding about the true nature of it. That is, the nature is the same regardless of who's interpreting it. They simply disagree with the human interpretation. That particular aspect is religion. Of course, religion is the component that deals specifically with the legalistic, the human. It goes beyond the spiritual and goes beyond sort of the theism, atheism thing. You can believe in a God and have no religion whatsoever. You can simply think the force is out there. You can be henotheistic and say, well, there's a God out there, but it's probably evil or whatever, and I don't really care. It has nothing to do with me. I have a different God. You had that sort of interplay, again, within earlier Hinduism, within certain pagan forms. You have a whole pantheon, but you'd have one particular being that you would, praise more than the others, potentially. Insofar as you're doing that, you may run up against other people whose interpretation of the entire same religion is totally different based on their understanding of that deity or any other, or based on which deities they prioritize, or how they choose to worship. The idea of sacrifice, for instance, within Islam, you have ritualistic killings of animals, especially camels and certain others, a ritualistic avoidance of pork. You have this within Judaism. You have certain Christian groups still adhere to that. Hindus would avoid generally eating beef. These are accepted ideas, but they're all the same basic concept, the same basic premise. At the same time, though, how is butchering a camel and Eid among Islamists different from some group of witches taking the fatted calf out and looking at its entrails out in the woods under a moonlit night with no clothes on? The only real difference is that the latter is not accepted by the former group, and vice versa. They see one another as barbaric because of these beliefs, which are fundamentally the same thing. This legalistic principle, especially within modern religion, tends to be post-Roman, because the Romans were very legalistic people, and before that, kind of the Greeks, and to an extent the Egyptians. But the Romans are really the ones that inform what becomes the core of Christendom, which informs Islam and many offshoots. There's influence on certain Eastern religions in the colonial era. And so you have the same materialistic, legalistic presence within all of these religions, where there's an accepted us and an unaccepted paganus, an unaccepted them. We are a priestly caste. They're a bunch of witches. We are religiously, we're fervent in our religion. We have great faith. They're fanatic barbarians. Really, the terminology that you get into, that's basically how it works. That's about all. Peace out.